Well, we are gifted tonight, if gifted is the right word, perhaps it's not, or at least blessed is probably an even more suitable word. We are honoured, certainly, with Eamonn Butler, who's going to give us a talk on a man who's written a book on, and that is Milton Friedman. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Eamonn.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, my title is Milton Friedman, Statist or Libertarian. And to me, he's a libertarian, but to you, he's probably a terrible statist. So I thought I would probably just describe a little bit about his thinking, and then you could make up your own mind. If I speak at this level, can everybody hear me? Yes? You don't want to swap places with somebody who can't? No? Fine. Okay. Well, hi, come in. Milton Friedman was, of course, a 20th century economist, born in 1912. He died in 2006, I think, in November. And he was born near New York and raised around that part of the world. He spent some time in working for the government during the Second World War, when basically anybody of any talent worked for the government. So he was part of the war effort, and spent some time in Washington, and then went to the National Bureau of Economic Research up in New York, and then back down to Washington again. But eventually he ended up at the University of Chicago, and he is known, I think, as the modern father of the quantity theory of money, of monetarism, the idea that the more money you have in circulation, the more money that governments print, the less it becomes worth, and therefore what that means is that prices rise. So he popularized the notion that that inflation, which was a very serious problem in the 50s, 60s and 70s, that inflation was a purely monetary phenomenon caused by governments playing fast and loose with the supply of money in circulation. And that's really what he's known for as an economist, although he did many other quite important things as an economist. He's also known, of course, for his book and TV series, a couple of books actually, Capitalism and Freedom, which came out in 1962, and then his other book, Free to Choose, which is a book that was based on a TV series that he did, going around the world and looking at different countries and making the case that it is markets and competition and free trade and enterprise and all of these good things which actually produce social and economic benefit, and that socialism has the opposite effect. So that's Milton Friedman. That's how he's generally known. I knew him personally. He was, he was about that high, actually. He was a very short man. And he used to go around with George Stigler, who was 6'4". It was quite an amazing difference between them. And he was a great communicator. He wrote in regular columns in Newsweek magazine. He wrote in the papers, and he appeared in Senate and congressional hearings and so on and so on. He was a very fluent communicator of the sorts of ideas which I think probably you and I all agree with. So that's Milton Friedman. On the one hand, I think that Milton Friedman, more than anybody, this is where I'm wearing my badge saying, "Have you thanked Milton Friedman today?" More than anybody, I think he helped reverse the tide of post-war socialism and of Keynesian economics, and to introduce the world to ideas of free markets and free exchange rates and all other sorts of things that were kind of thought to be absolutely unthinkable prior to, about 1960 or 65. And I think more than anybody else, we owe a debt to him for doing that. And He, of course, advised many countries, famously Chile, where he told the dictator, Mr. Pinochet, that firstly he should have a free market economy, and then secondly he should have elections and stand down, which pretty much, it took a little time, but yes, he did. And similarly, he when China started to open up, he was out there in China giving them some advice on how to create a more market economy in China. Mark Lahr, who's a very interesting chap, who was the first Prime Minister of Estonia when Eastern Europe was opening up. Mark Lahr told me that when he was a mere economist under the old Soviet days, that they couldn't get Western economics books. And the only one he was able to put his hands on was Free to Choose. So he thought, this is what Western economics is all about. So we'd better do this. And so he told everybody, right, this is what we're going to do. And he said, luckily, he didn't have Western economists there telling him that it couldn't be done. So they did it, and it was, of course, a great success. And Estonia became one of the leading growth countries of the former Soviet bloc. So I think that Friedman has powerful credentials to be called a libertarian, and yet at the same time he did work within, if you like, the existing model that Friedmanism, if you like, and Keynesianism are two different horses, but they sort of come from the same stable. And they're the same sort of neoclassical view of economics. And Friedman himself described himself as a liberal rather than a libertarian. And he said specifically that a consistent liberal is not an anarchist. But on the other hand, once again, he did believe in a huge range of human freedom. So where do you stand? Well, let me just take you through some of the different parts of his work and thinking. Firstly, on the role of government, if we look at that. As I said, he said the consistent liberal is not an anarchist, so he was not in favour of just tearing up all the laws and starting again. He took the view, and he says, human beings are not perfect, they're not angels. If they were angels, they would govern themselves without any trouble at all. But they're not angels, and so they need some kind of government, state, whatever you like, some kind of government, he says, in order basically to restrain them. And that his view as the role of government is to put restraints on people to promote a harmonious social order. And as I said, he was close into governments. He advised politicians. He advised Barry Goldwater. He advised Richard Nixon, although he fell out with him when, in 1971, Richard Nixon imposed wage and price controls, which Friedman was very much against. And he advised Reagan. I mean, all of these things informally. There was no sort of formal contract or anything like that. But these politicians went to Milton Friedman, drew him into meetings for advice. And I suppose on the statist side of the balance, I have to work out which side is statist. That's statism, that's libertarianism. So right, so I'm pointing that way. He's a libertarian. When I'm pointing that way, he's a statist, right? So on the statist side, looking at the role of government, he thought that government did have an extremely important and powerful role. Firstly, of course, it was to maintain law and order and defence, so it had functions over policing and defence. That the government was there to adjudicate in disputes when people were arguing on points of property or whatever, that the state had to be there to provide a system of justice and rebalancing. And the state also had an important role in defining what were the rules of property. Friedman does not believe that property rights are just kind of given and you don't even need to think about them, they're just obvious. He says that property is a very complicated set of rules. If I own this piece of land, does that stop somebody flying in an aeroplane over the top? And does it matter whether they make a lot of noise doing it or not? So these are complicated things to work out, and they're generally worked out in courts and other things over the courses of several generations. So the rules of property are not obvious, and you need some authority to decide what the rules of property actually are. He also thought that government had an important role in promoting competition. He believed in antitrust law, anti-monopoly legislation. He believed that government had a function to maintain sound money, and he, I think, really believed that money was something which was for government to issue. Maybe not as a logical thing, maybe logically it might be possible for other people to issue currency, but when it boils down to it, let's face it, governments issue currency, they always have done, always will. So one function of government would be to keep that system of money sound and make sure that money didn't lose its value. He also felt that government had a role in dealing with things like pollution and spillover effects. When you do something, when you build a factory and the soot dirties other people's laundry, well, then the government needs to do something about that. And he also believed in a measure of welfare. He says that government, that you should prefer private charity to help the indigent and destitute, but you might have to supplement that, and that is something which the government can reasonably do, and in protecting mentally incapable as well, which is another thing that he believed. So that's all, I suppose, on if you like, the statist side. On the other side, well, I mentioned antitrust policy, but I think you could probably put this on both sides, actually, because, yes, he believed that the government had a role in breaking up monopolies, but, yes, he didn't believe in monopoly. He thought that competition was very powerful and important, and that we should try to make sure that we get it. He also believed that government was too big. Very, very eloquent in arguing that case, very effective in arguing that case, and that it was too centralised, that in particular power had gone from local authorities and neighbourhoods and so on and been drawn into Washington or Whitehall. And he had a prejudice against government intervening in things. His view was that most government interventions fail or do the opposite of what they were intended to do. When you look at things like housing or government job creation policies, these he thought were entirely inconsistent, that they generally achieved worse housing and cost jobs rather than created them. I don't know which side of the balance to put this one on, probably a little bit of both. He did propose constitutional limits on government spending. He promoted the so-called balanced budget amendment in America, constitutional amendment. And I think you could probably put that on either side. Yes, he wanted government spending to be reduced and certainly government borrowing to be reduced, but he was quite prepared to use the mechanisms of the state in order to try to achieve that. So that's Friedman on the role of government. Taxation, a bit shorter. On the one side, when Friedman was in Washington during the war, he did actually work on the withholding tax, the sort of American equivalent of PAYE, and he sort of more or less actually invented it. So you could put him down as a terrible statist for doing that. But to his credit, on the libertarian side, he did actually say many years later that a withholding tax was the worst idea that he'd ever worked on, and he regretted having done it, but it seemed a good idea at the time. And he also championed flat taxes. Again, I don't know which side of the equation you put this on. I suppose if you're an out-and-out libertarian, you don't really believe in taxes at all. But Friedman thought that if you're going to have taxes, have a flat tax, so everybody pays the same. The poor don't pay anything at all, but everybody else pays the same. So we can see what people are due, and there's no complicated exemptions and allowances and all of that sort of stuff, which allows Rupert Murdoch to fiddle it and hide behind it and pay nothing. So there you are. So that's role of government taxation. In terms of his economic approach, before we get on to the sort of political stuff, again, I think you could put him on the sort of statist equation, because he rejected the Austrian approach. He was steeped in neoclassical economics, and he did believe that the use of aggregates like the money supply, the price level, the volume of demand, that these were actually all rather useful measures. I'm sure that he didn't believe that these things sort of existed somehow on their own. He knew that they were statistical measures, but he was a statistician, and he looked at these things and looked for relationships between them. And he believed that economics was a science just like any other physical science, and it should be a predictive science, that you should look to see what is going on. You should run your statistics, run your measurements, and if you see that two things go up like that, well, that is a basis for prediction that they will continue to go up like that. And if they go that way, then again that tells you something, and you can make predictions about the future. And if you're wrong, and you have to revise your theory. But it's the same philosophy of science as it would be for physics or chemistry or any of the other sciences. So that would put Friedman very much on a side which is not occupied by the likes of Mises and to some extent Hayek, but many of the mainline Austrians. Hayek, yes, Hayek is more sort of British in that. British empirical, yeah, that's right. But certainly, the German Austrians, if you like, they don't accept that sort of analysis at all. On the statist side, Friedman memorably did say we're all Keynesians now, but on the libertarian side, his next sentence was, but in a larger sense, none of us are Keynesians, because we've moved on from that. And his view was, on this side, I think again, that Keynesian institutions like the Federal Reserve Bank system, which was, of course, designed to prevent bank crises after the 1907 bank crisis in America, that system had actually made things worse and indeed had precipitated the Great Depression, the banking crisis. And indeed, the Fed ended up shutting all of America's banks for 2 weeks. And this was an institution which was supposed to stop bank failures and stop banks closing. He also believed that stimulus packages don't work, that it's all very well to say that we're going to create jobs, but that takes money, and where's the money going to come from? Well, it either comes from taxation, so it comes out of somebody else's pocket, or it comes from inflation, which taxes us all, or it comes from borrowing, which is somebody's pocket who doesn't even have a pocket because they're not born yet, as it comes from the next generation. So I think he did have a very libertarian view, or liberal view, if you like, on public spending, no question about that. I said that one of his great contributions was on monetary theory and inflation. So that's the next thing which I just wanted to review. I think, again, on the libertarian side, you have to say that Friedman was an earnest proponent of how evil inflation was. that his view, shared of course by Hayek and many of the Austrians, was that inflation causes unemployment. It's not a trade-off as people thought after the war with the so-called Phillips curve. People assumed that if you have a little bit of inflation, you pump some money into the economy, okay, prices go up a bit, but it creates employment, and that in turn creates, people are in jobs, and then they go out and spend money, and that creates more jobs, and Keynesian multiplier and all the rest of it. He thought, no, absolutely not, and he did quite a bit of work on that. He thought that, once again, that inflation disrupted the economy. He says that when all prices are rising, it's very hard to separate the noise of all of that from the signal of, one price going up there or one price going down there. And investors need to know what individual prices are doing. So if all prices are going up, at weird rates, it's hard to know what's going on. His solution to that was a statist one, which is that the government really ought to get a grip over the supply of money. He thought that a gold standard was probably impractical. He did advocate at some stage a commodity-backed currency, something that was hard and tangible and had a value in its own. But he doubted very much that a gold standard could ever work because, we're not going to carry around gold bars to pay our bills and so on. And
small bits of gold.
If you managed to, yes, and if you made every transaction in gold, the price of gold would be up there, and you'd be talking about such a small bit, to buy a drink that you couldn't see. So you'd end up saying, well, here's a piece of paper that's worth that much gold. So you end up with what you've got at the moment. You end up with something which
we'll come back to that.
You end up with something very like what we've got at the moment, which is a system which can be abused. Is one thing that you can overissue these warehouse receipts, and that gets you in the same problem we are really with fiat currency. So his answer was a monetary rule. That the supply of money established by governments should expand at a fairly smooth rate, which roughly reflected the increase in the productivity or output of the economy, so that there was always enough money and prices weren't rising and prices weren't generally falling. And he also believed that government services, pensions, welfare benefits and taxes should be indexed so that governments couldn't benefit from having a sudden spurt of inflation, printing money, letting prices go up so that they could then repay their debts, as we're doing now, in devalued currency. On the libertarian Austrian Hayekian side, he did argue for 100% reserve banking. He didn't think it was very likely to happen, but at the same time, the likelihood of something happening never actually stopped him advocating things. And he said that economists are usually very bad judges of what's politically possible, so you might as well say what you believe in and hope that it might actually happen. And also, I suppose, just to put this under money as well, he was a leading advocate of floating exchange rates. He believed that fixed exchange rates were simple price fixing like any other price fixing. And it's just like the price of bread. If the price is too low, then people buy lots of bread and use it for all sorts of purposes like building material rather than as food. And that exchange rates were exactly the same. If the dollar was too low, then people would want as many of them as they could get, or as few of them as they could get, I should say. Regulation is another heading where I think it's interesting. On regulation, Friedman was pretty libertarian. He wanted to see the end of price controls, which he thought had driven up the cost of housing and driven down, in particular, the quality of housing, which he said you've only got to look at New York to see that. It's had rent controls for many decades. He believed in ending the mail monopoly. He said the only reason that the United States government had a monopoly of the mail is because the Pony Express did such a good job that the feds couldn't compete. And I think this is quite radical, he was opposed to licensing of any professions, including doctors and lawyers. He thought that private institutions might do this job and probably do it rather better. But he was very suspicious of regulations, and he writes in great length about, really going back to Adam Smith, about the tendency of businesses, big businesses in particular, to demand regulations from the politicians, because that helps them, because big businesses can get along with regulations and small businesses can't, because it costs them too much money. Big business can have a fleet of compliance officers, a small business can't. And so it reduces competition, and he felt that big business was one of the they were no friends of the free market, and a lot of regulation came from that source. On the sort of statist side, he did believe in the registration of a number of professions. I mean, he says specifically, you get in a taxi in New York, and indeed in London, or wherever you are, in Rome or whatever, and there's a number there, and it's a registration number, so that if the driver cheats you, you get taken the wrong way, or something happens, or you get assaulted. There's a number there which is relatively easy to remember, so that person, the driver, can be identified and brought to book. So he thought that simple things like that, of course, were entirely okay. I don't know quite where that ends, of course. You can have all sorts of little rules like that end up costing businesses quite a lot of money. But he did believe in some controls like that. In terms of the human services, health, education, welfare, he was fairly libertarian on that. He didn't believe in compulsory schooling. If parents didn't want to send their kids to school, he didn't see why they should be forced to. At the same time, he did think that, well, we have to deal with the education system that we're given, which is 90-something% state, and developed or rediscovered, I suppose, it's a 19th century idea, but rediscovered the idea of education vouchers, which is, pretty much of a sort of state solution where, but it's introducing competition within the state sector. So you could still have public and private schools, but you have a system whereby parents are given a voucher for the value of an education, which they can then spend at any school they like. He didn't conceive of that, I don't think, as being a sort of private enterprise system. He conceived of that as being a government-run system, but he believed in it because he thought it was a lot better than what we have now. He didn't believe in state-run medicine, but looking at state pensions, again, I think he thought this was sort of inevitable, but it would be much better to replace the state pay-as-you-go pyramid scheme, Ponzi scheme, with one which is based on personal accounts that you pay into when you're young, and then you can draw the money out when you're older. He, on the welfare front, he didn't believe in a minimum wage. He thought that was counterproductive. He didn't believe in price controls to help poor people. He did believe in a negative income tax. He thought that you had to do something to help poorer people, and that rather than have 101, or he did give a number, something like 306 different American state programs to help the poor, just give them the money and then they can go away, they're not poor anymore. So that kind of solves the problem. So he thought that would be a much better way of doing it. But it is, it is definitely a sort of state welfare measure. In terms of the individual and the state, he did take much of his thinking from John Stuart Mill. He, at the end of Capitalism and Freedom, he tears into President Kennedy's inaugural address, where Kennedy says, "Don't ask what your country can do for you. You ask
Completely
for what
statist.
you can do. That's right. And he attacks that as being completely statist, and it's and he believes that the individual must come first, and the state is just a group of individuals getting together for mutual purposes. But the individual takes priority. So I put him on the libertarian side of that. And he saw the market and individual freedom as a counterweight to politics. So he wanted to grow markets and have more done by the markets because that took power from politicians. He was against the draft, the military draft, sending kids to Vietnam, and eventually successfully too. And of course he believed that drugs should be decriminalised. He thought that most of the harm that came from drugs was due to the fact that they were illegal rather than that they were nasty substances. They are nasty substances, or some of them are nasty substances, but at the same time it was the illegality which caused most of the problem. So I put him on the libertarian side there. So I don't know where that leaves you. I mean, I think he's a bit of both. He believed in smaller governments and competition and choice and free trade and all of these good things. And yet, he was, I suppose, if you like, a realist and figured, well, the state is, at the moment, what, it's 50% of our lives. So you have to deal with that. And sometimes the power that the state has can be a useful one in order to create new markets and indeed to wither away the power of the state itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Should we stop for a while to refresh our glasses? And that's just one or two people are drinking. Should we refresh our glasses for a while?
Oh, yes.
I'm all right, but
5 minutes.
You're okay with that?
yeah, I'm fine. Thanks very much.
Might be on the other end.
For a few
We can carry
minutes?
on talking.
Whatever you like.
Sorry?
Well, you can refresh your glass.
First things first, eh?
In the lavatory. Well, you can refresh other parts. What do you think? I mean, really?
What do I think? I think he was the greatest force for liberty that we have seen in 100 years.
I think he's a great advocate of competition. Yes.
Right.
Free business, but not free banking. It's pretty much him.
Yeah.
But why did he have this? Well, it must be. Is it a Keynesian thing, the Chicago School thing? That you must, how can I put it? You must accommodate growth by increasing the money supply. Why did he think that?
I think probably he had taken the Keynesian view that falling prices had problems. That deflation it does cause difficulties, and what he wanted is zero, basically.
Sure. Obviously, if prices plunge by 30% in a year, that's not good.
Well, maybe.
But as George Selgin has said, there's good deflation and bad deflation. If it's just gently falling prices because of increased productivity, as the Victorians had,
yeah,
that's no bad.
You get a certain stickiness. I mean, according to Keynes, wages, for example, are inflexible downwards. Nobody likes taking a pay cut, and so if you've got inflation, it's not so obvious that you're taking a pay cut, and therefore, wages can adjust more easily. Whereas if inflation is zero, it's bloody obvious that you're getting a pay cut, and people resist that, you see. So
if it's not a real pay cut, I mean, if their pay buys more than ever, would there be so fussed? There'd be a big fuss.
no, I see. You mean if
Price,
productivity is
secular
improving and all
price
that
fall.
kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Does it not work the other way around as well? If inflation's running high, people will demand high pay.
Well, they do actually. Yes.
Well.
Yeah, we discovered that during the late 60s, early 70s. That what would happen is the unions would, you got inflation at 12%. The unions would bargain for 12% plus a pay increase, another 2%. And then plus the 12 that they thought they'd probably lose next year. So they were demanding 26% pay increases. So that is a problem too. But that's only that's when inflation is high. If inflation is 1 or 2%, then people don't notice it very much. But that it gives you that, according to Keynes at least, it gives you that flexibility for wages to adjust, which it wouldn't do if it was zero. I'm not saying I agree with all that, but
Wasn't he influenced by Fisher, who believed in basic inflation?
yeah. I mean, in his essay on the quantity theory of money, he goes through all of these formulations. Starting with David Hume and so on. That the more money you create, the less it's worth, and then going on to Fisher, and then the Cambridge formulation. It goes through all of these different.
Was he a pupil of Fisher? I forget. Or was quite heavily influenced by him?
I think he was influenced by him. I don't think he was ever a pupil of Fisher's. I don't think so. Yeah, go on. Did you want to?
Yeah, I was very interested to read in your book that his first degree was in mathematics.
It's always a bad sign, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And he did his, then I think as a postgraduate he was a statistician.
That's correct.
I just wonder whether he would have been. I choose my words carefully. I wonder if those parts of his economics that I think some of us feel quite uncomfortable with, might have featured less prominently in his work if he hadn't had that background.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. Yes, mathematics was what he was good at, and he, at school he was very gifted in mathematics, and that's one of the reasons why, he was advanced. Well, he started studying mathematics, and then it was basically by chance that he met some economists and thought this economics stuff is pretty good, so let's do that. And therefore, yes, his approach to economics is very non-Austrian, and it's very mathematical and it's very statistical. But Friedman defended that. Friedman said that if you do the statistics, and if you see that there is a relationship between one figure and another, then it sort of indicates that there's something going on which is interesting, and you can use that as the basis of prediction. You don't necessarily know what the mechanism is, but if when A goes up, B always goes up, well, that's, fine.
And yet, when he said that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, that doesn't really sound like simply a sort of assertion based on an examination of lots of data. It sounds like a general theory.
Oh, that's the wisdom of decades distilled into one phrase. Yes, he coined that on a trip to India, I think it was. He was giving some lectures and was just trying to sort of encapsulate his view. No, I mean, actually, if you look at his monetary theory, which is far too boring to discuss here, but let's face it.
Right, as a theory, isn't it? Just a correlation.
Oh, yes, that's right. But that's his view of the philosophy of science, which is that you propose a theory, and the theory is, in economics, this magnitude, this aggregate, or this statistic does that. Well, when it does, this one goes out, and so on and so on. That is a theory. Your theory is that will carry on happening. And, tomorrow it might not happen, and then you have to adjust your theory. But his view was that trying to understand the world is a process of theorizing, that you put forward a point of view that I think it works this way, and as long as it works that way, that's fine. Newton put forward a theory which lasted for a very long time, but then people start saying, yeah, but there's this little discrepancy here, what about that, which you can't explain, and then you have to adjust your theory. So he thought that economics was a scientific endeavour, which Mises would have him shot for, obviously.
Bob?
Yes. Apart from the fact he said, to say it doesn't matter if it's true or not, it's just useful, or it predicts.
It doesn't matter how radical the assumptions are, as long as it gets the right answer.
That's right.
That's pragmatism.
And also, the trouble with saying, and this goes with this, is that when, if you're old enough, and you may be old enough, to remember when he came to address some meeting of howling economists, I don't think it was the Royal Society, because they wouldn't have economists there. Anyway, it was some bear pit of a terrorist hall, and he was addressing them, and he was saying, well, look, here you have the money supply, you have inflation,
Yeah.
And he said, and when the Confederate printing works,
No, that's right.
when
Yes.
the money was being printed, were captured, the inflation stopped. And he said, oh, you're advocating, confiscating the printing works, But of course, that's correlation. They were saying,
Yes.
as did the Germans in 1920s, you can't print enough money. You just can't. The prices are going up so fast. We have to get this money out.
Well, that's what happens. Yeah.
Yeah. So
that's what happens.
They could argue that it was whatever they called it, cost push, cost pull, whatever it was. Doesn't matter. Terms don't matter. The point is, they thought it was the fact that people are asking for a lot more.
Right.
Therefore, a lot more money had to be created just to keep the whole thing going.
Yeah. Well, Friedman, you'll have to read the book. Friedman has a very simple illustration against that. I'm not sure where it occurs. I think it might have been in one of his Newsweek columns that he wrote every third week for many years. And he says prices are going up in America, this is. And he says, who's to blame? Well, you ask the shopkeeper, and the shopkeeper says, well, I can't help it. My wholesaler is putting the price up. And you ask the wholesaler, and the wholesaler says, well, I can't help it. My prices are going up. The cost of my energy is going up, and the price of fuel's going up, and transportation costs are going up, and then my raw materials are going up. And then you ask the people who produce the power and the energy and the transportation and the raw materials, and they say, well, no, my costs are going up as well. So everybody says, I'm not raising prices just for the hell of it. I'm raising prices because my prices are going up. And he says, and you trace that back, and where does the buck stop? And the answer is it stops at the printing press in the Treasury in Washington. And that was really his view of inflation, that it wasn't cost push or demand pull or anything like that. It was simply due to the amount of money in circulation. And the amount of money in circulation is a difficult concept, and there's different sorts of money and all the rest of it. But that's really what it boils down to, and therefore it is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. That's where it comes from originally. And yes, there may be spurts of demand for one reason or another, and there may be exceptional costs that come in, like the oil crisis and all of that in the 70s and all of that sort of stuff. It can only have a temporary effect, because if there's a certain amount of money in circulation and one price goes up, well, another's got to come down, because just isn't enough money to go around.
Well, it was said of the oil crisis that the oil prices pushed up every other price, but
of course it hasn't.
Other prices would have come down.
Yeah, but if there's only a certain amount of money in the economy, then where does the money come from to push the prices up? So, in other words, the price has to go down somewhere else.
David?
Well, there was a tantalising passage in your book where you referred to Friedman at his most radical, suggesting that perhaps money should be denationalised altogether. Can you elaborate on that? Because I don't know where.
Crumbs. You've got me.
It's
Did you say?
chapter, I think, on.
Did you say that?
Well, he said freeze the monetary base, which is almost the same thing.
No, the suggestion that in.
Chapter on inflation.
I'll tell you what, why do you take another question while I find the passage?
That sounds sensible.
Is there any other question coming forward?
Did he favour narrow or broad money use of money in the aggregate?
Well, there's another question I don't actually quite remember the answer to, but he was fully aware that there were lots and lots and lots of possible definitions of money, and that almost anything could be used as money. Houses can be used as money to some extent, and therefore, there is a continuous spectrum. I think he believed that the most useful measure was. Thanks very much. All right. Yeah. Thanks very much. Was basically notes and coins in circulation and bank current accounts. In other words, a pretty narrow definition of money, and he thought that had the biggest predictive power. And I think he's probably right, actually. Seems to be the case, and that's why he thought that it was so important that the government should control the apex, if you like, that it was the notes and coins which then affected everything else. So notes, coins, and immediate deposits. Yeah. So what's he say here? Well, 100% reserve requirements. I said that. Yes, that's right.
Keep going.
Have to keep the entire amount of their customers' deposits in their vaults. Yes, rather than lending. Although banks could still be investment banks as well. But you had to have the option that if you wanted a really safe bank, that you.
It's the last sentence.
Yeah. Okay. The banks would still conduct investment business, lending out funds to clients for this purpose, but this would become entirely separate. Friedman would also stop the banks buying government debt. At his most radical, Friedman proposed entirely abolishing central banks. Central banks, which he argued were so corrupted by their closeness to politicians, they couldn't be trusted to manage the money supply responsibly. Better let money be produced like other goods by the private market.
We'll get him to give a talk on Eamonn Butler.
Yes, you know a lot more about the subject than I do. Yes. I mean, I think he did occasionally say, yes, we should abolish. Well, I mean, he said quite a number of times, let's abolish the Fed.
He did long enough to say many things.
Indeed, let's abolish the Fed. I'm not sure I agree on that. You do need a lender of last resort somehow.
Put that very.
Sorry, Bob.
Sorry, Bob. First resort. That's what they are.
I mean, that's a contention. But I mean, is it the case, from your understanding, that Friedman's? I mean, he's very well known, obviously, for the suggestion that it is the role of government to ensure that there is a gentle expansion in the money supply, as you say, to match the increase in production.
Yeah.
But was that something that he thought in principle was a good thing? Or would he, all things being equal, prefer to leave the supply of money to the market, as was on one occasion suggested by Hayek, and as is a sort of fairly universal view, I think, of most of the Austrians? So was what he was proposing a sort of, well, if the government is going to do it, then we should have constitutional rules to make sure that the expansion of the money supply is very, very limited and it can't be interfered with by politicians? Or did he regard that actually as being the best of all possible worlds?
No, I think that he took the position that, let's face it, money is produced by governments, and it's always going to be produced by governments, and we might dream, or Hayek might dream. I don't know, actually. I don't really remember him talking.
I don't think he did.
I don't think he did. I don't think he did. And I think he, he was sufficiently steeped in neoclassical economics, and even he grew up in the Keynesian era.
It was a positive role.
Yes, absolutely.
Good thing.
I think he assumed that money was one of these things that you could only have one. Basically, you couldn't have lots of them. It just didn't kind of make sense.
Except lots of knuckle.
We have 200 of them.
I heard, not very far from here actually, but it was many, many, many years, decades indeed ago, Ludwig Lachmann talking about Hayek on the denationalisation of money, and was saying that even for Hayek, that wasn't a sort of noble aspiration. It was a sort of desperation that things had got so bad that what could you do? All you can do is to suggest that, well, perhaps we should allow people to create money of their own and have some competition. But it wasn't as if this was a sort of shining image that he had. It was just a way of doing something that was better than the monopoly that we had at the moment. So, I've heard the same said of Hayek, in other words, curiously. He's had too many goes.
I think someone else though.
Yes.
Did you have your hand up?
Well, just following up, I guess Friedman would have then, I'm curious what his thoughts would have been on a development like Bitcoin or trading over video. He probably wouldn't have been too much of a...
Fortunately for me, he's safely and quietly dead, so I can't tell you.
But so
I think
sort of in principle...
My guess is, from what I remember of him, my guess is that he would say, oh, well, it's all very well, but, if it works, it'll be really great, but, we've got the US dollar, and that's what we've got to deal with. I think that's probably what his line would be. So you take the reality of the world and improve it rather than just go out on a limb and as with bitcoins, something that may or may not work. We don't know.
The unthinkable.
Well, he was very curious on that actually, because, as I say, to some extent, he was quite restrained in terms of what he proposed. He wanted to propose things which were sort of at least acceptable, but at the same time, he also said that the politicians are very bad judges of what's politically doable. So go for it because it might be doable. I mean, things like the floating exchange rates were just thought unthinkable for most of the post-war era, and I remember, I've talked about it. People like Geoffrey Howe, the Chancellor in Mrs. Thatcher's government, who stood up in the House of Commons one day and said, exchange controls have been around for far too long and we're going to abolish them. And there was sort of silence, and people in the press gallery said, what did he say? Because nobody believed that it was possible. Everybody thought that if you removed exchange controls, currency would flood out of Britain and would flood in other places, and there'd be complete turmoil. It'd be a market, for goodness sake, and nobody would know where they are, and that you had to have capital controls. So, in the early 80s, the government really was sailing on uncharted waters. They didn't know themselves how this was going to pan out. It could have been the most awful disaster. In fact, it works famously. And these days, you and I go abroad, and we go down and we change our currency, and we get whatever the day's rate, and we don't even think about it. But 30 years ago, that was just unbelievable. And it was Friedman, as much as anybody, that made that change.
Later, if there's no one else.
Nico.
As a libertarian, I of course think that the proof is onto the Statist to prove that the state is a useful institution. And where does Friedman stand on this? Does he just believe that the state is the natural thing, and as a liberal, as he calls himself, you have to argue in favor of trying to reduce the amount of state at certain points, or does he actually believe that the state can really do the greatest job in certain areas like licensing and stuff? And if he thought that, how did he argue that point that the state is the best institution to do these kind of jobs?
Well, my answer might start rambling because I've run out of lubrication. Oh, how kind! Thank you very much. No, I don't think Friedman had any great love of the state as an institution. He believed in smaller governments. He thought the government had grown too large, that it was doing too much, or too many different things. It was taking too many powers from the individual, and that individuals should have priority over governments. And yet, somehow he. I don't really want to overstate this, because he was a huge advocate of smaller government, but he thought the government had some function. And as Adam Smith thought the government had some function, Adam Smith is even more confused about it. But he thought that it had, because of its coercive power, that it had that it must be limited, but that it had some function in terms of administration of justice, actually creating this market that we all believe in, and not creating competition, but allowing competition to exist, and not repressing competition by regulations and high taxes and all of that sort of stuff. So on any issue, I think he would say to you that, yes, he's on your side, he believes in a smaller government. But I think that he also took the reality of the situation and was trying to convince politicians, if you like, to do the right thing as much as anybody else. You know, he was intellectually interested in what was the right thing to do, but also he was a fantastic communicator, and he I think he wouldn't have been so grand to admit it, but I think he did think that his skills were to persuade people just to come over a little bit and, you know, come away from the state a bit and just think of another way of doing this, like licensing doctors. You know, again, almost unthinkable even today that we should not license doctors. I mean, it's just unbelievable. But you know, he said, well, you know, he did a long study on professional licensing, and he indicated, you know, and that proved to him that licensing raised the costs to the public and gave them a worse service. So get rid of it.
But was he an advocate, like, you have to prove that the state does not work in a certain area in order to justify the abolishment of certain state programs? Because, I mean, that's a different kind of argumentation than the libertarian would argue, that you actually have to justify it to show really that a government is necessary and useful. Because other than Adam Smith, Friedman did know anarchists. I mean, he lived until a few years ago, I think. When did he die? And he,
well, his son is very much sounder than he was. Yeah.
So he knew the anarchist argumentation, and there must be some argument from him with he rejected this argumentation.
Phew. Well, he and I both knew Murray Rothbard, and I think that probably put him off. I don't know, sorry if there were any friends of Murray Rothbard. I never liked the man. But his prejudice, if you like, and it's a good prejudice, was always in favour of less government. I'm not sure. I think he's a bit like me, that he doesn't have a sort of blueprint of how society ought to be. I mean, you know, you can argue that that's one of the problems, is people who have blueprints as to how society ought to be ordered. But I think his view and mine is, let's try scrapping a few things and see if it still works. And if it still works, then that's just fine. Oh, good man, you got yourself some at the same time.
Yeah,
very good. Very good, very good.
But then his advocacy for the school voucher program shows that he's willing for the government to reform as much as long as you increase competition, it's still okay for the
yes, that's right. Yes, yeah. I mean, I think sort of on education, I think that's a reasonable example. Look, right, you know, the state's run education for the last 150 years. There's no sign that it's ever going to retreat. So what can we do to draw its fangs? And what can we do to start growing, if you like, a better system? And it's, I always say this is the French barn technique, right? You buy if you want to build a house in northern France, you can't do it, right? Planning permission and all the rest of it. So what you do is you buy a barn, an old barn, then basically you build a house inside it is what you do. And then eventually, because of the weather, the barn falls to bits and you're left with a house. And I think he was he took that sort of view of politics, that you set in flow a few reforms which then actually undermine the whole state project, because the more people that you can move, say, from state education into a voucher system, they'll love it, and then they won't want the state thing anymore. So his prejudice was the state's rubbish in education. We know it's rubbish in education. If I stand up and say it's rubbish in education, nothing's going to happen. But if I produce a mechanism which may rely on a state administration of a program, but I produce a project which will actually make that one wither away, well, that's great. So I think that's where he came. Sort of practical political approach almost.
Oliver?
Given the title of the talk and the status was, do you think Friedman believed that government could be self-limiting? That he had an idea of a steady state, and that he believed, because what he also indicated, he thought if you just get rid of these, you made a case for education for licensing doctors, and it seems before which did he think that that call was self-limiting and people just going to just vote perfectly right now, just leave it as it is?
No, he certainly didn't think that it was self-limiting, and he writes in various places.
It couldn't be self-limiting.
Could be. Oh, with constitution, we didn't really get into the constitutional stuff. I mean, it didn't come till later, I guess, with Buchanan and Tulloch and all these characters. Although, again, I suppose, but I suppose calculus of consent by Buchanan and Tulloch was 62, so that was quite early, but he never really got into that stuff, I don't think. He did write about how voracious governments were, and he looks at the history of the American government, and I don't know, in 1910 it takes about 10% of the income, and it whoosh, suddenly goes up, or it goes up particularly with the New Deal. So he was very critical of the Roosevelt era. And also said that the more programs you had, the more concentrated it had to be, and that if a government is saying, well, we can solve all ills, from unemployment to prices to whatever, then it has to accumulate powers to itself, and that's what tends to happen, and therefore power tends to come away from individuals and communities and local governments and so on, and it comes up to the centre. So he thought that was by no means self-limiting. And then in The Tyranny of the Status Quo, which is a book he wrote in, I think, 1984, he says there's a sort of iron triangle. There's the politicians who want more public spending because they can use that to buy votes and all the rest of it. There's the bureaucracy, who are again wanted, and there's also business, unfortunately, which again likes a strong government, and particularly big business, and like all this regulation. And so he's saying that there's that kind of iron triangle sitting there in Washington. And it's very hard for the rest of us to break that up, but we must break that up. So it's not a case of this isn't self-limiting at all. No question.
David?
Do you think that it would be a fair comment to say that the further Friedman got away from his core subject, the more libertarian he was?
Yes.
So you start right in the middle with this pure economic theory. I'm sure about that. And you get further out. So he's got some good stuff on price control and breakfast, sort of semi-economic. You get more and more out. You've got these great books to choose in Capitalism and Freedom. Really, although not perfect, undoubtedly a great propagandist for liberty. And certainly that's the way that I see it here, as with many other libertarians. I mean, almost Rothbard, actually. So I think, well, a lot of what Rothbard wrote right in the centre of it, his philosophy was a bit sort of dodgy and natural right, not much about that, but a great propagandist on any view, whether you like him or not. And I sometimes see Friedman like that. Is that a fair comment?
Yes, I mean, it's interesting that his books on popular politics, there are three really. There's Capitalism and Freedom, 1962. There is the Food Jews, 1980. And then there's this 1984 Tyranny of the Status Quo, which is a short book, but it's, and it's very American.
But all the other things that he wrote as well.
But no, I'm just saying, but of those three, it's interesting. They're all co-authored by his wife.
Yes, that's right.
And she was shorter than he was.
It was even shorter than she was, yes. Not by very much. She was a little bit shorter. And that is interesting. And he said specifically of Capitalism and Freedom, where it says, by Milton Friedman, with Rose Friedman. And he said that's a gross understatement, that, she sort of organised it and planned it.
Do we have a John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor?
Yeah, there's something like that. Yeah, that's right. And so, there is a point of view, and Rose never really, she was not demonstrative, and she just stayed in his shadow and never sort of claimed anything for herself. But, there is a kind of point of view that he was a lot better when she was there behind him telling him what to do. So, yeah, I think you're probably right. Yes, and on things like drugs and the draft, he was extremely libertarian. On things like monetary policy, well,
Well,
years ago, I much enjoyed his. Was he one about money? Money and something. Anyway, it was rather good. He was arguing for floating exchange rates.
Sure.
And given that I was brought up on sad old Britain going down like an old ship, can't pay its way, currency crises, devaluing the pound, all this stuff, we have to join Europe or snug it up to richer people than we are, we can't go on like this.
That's right. Yes.
And nearly all of it was simply due to the fact that they had inflation with fixed exchange rates. That's it. It wasn't due to lazy workers or incompetent managers. I'm sure there were plenty,
that's right.
but still,
I think that's right.
the mere crises was simply they had inflation with a fixed exchange rate. This is dumb.
Well, what?
And he was good at pointing out you could have floating ones. But some libertarian economists now say yes, and they plunged like stones once they were allowed to float.
nowhere.
Oh yeah, sure.
So-
Yeah. What you have to buy the book and and what yes, absolutely, and what I'm saying is I think chapter 1 is I've called it The Economist Who Changed Everything, because he did change everything, because during the war, after the war, 50s, 60s, part of the 70s, everybody believed this stuff, right? And they just thought there was no other way of doing it, that you had to have a fixed exchange rate, that it would be absolute crisis if you didn't, and think that exchange rates would be all over the place and so on. And they thought they didn't know that inflation was caused by money, just didn't know. So you could print as much money as you want, all the rest of it, and he changed all that, and it was almost unthinkable at the time. People got trapped in the downward spiral. I emigrated to America, for God's sake, in the 1970s, right? Because I saw no hope for this country, because it was in exactly that downward spiral you've described, and it's purely a spiral caused by regulation of exchange rates and all the rest of it, and the economic sclerosis. And his view was, well, that's all crazy. Just have the market. Have the market in exchange rates and so on. And everybody thought this guy's, and they really did, and they vilified him, and they, and people thought that he was just complete barking outsider. In fact, he says, I hope I can remember this. He says at one stage that there are 4 stages. You maybe remember it better than I do. In the acceptance of an idea, firstly everybody says, "Oh, he's completely crazy." Firstly they say they don't even acknowledge that you exist, right? The status quo is the status quo, and that's it. And there's this, outsider. They don't even. And then they sort of acknowledge that you exist, but say, "Oh, he's completely crazy." There you go, this Friedman guy. And then they say, "Well, there may be something in what this Friedman chap says, you see." And then afterwards, oh yes, we all believe in that.
we believe it all along.
That's right, and that's how it works, and people are very loath to give up their prejudices. It's Kuhn structure of scientific revolutions and so on. People don't give up what they've been bred into, because that's what they believe.
Of course, what you've just told of is a story where they do give up their prejudices.
Well,
you understand that.
Well, reality is fantastic. Reality, and I look at this as I contemplate the euro, and you've got so many people in continental Europe saying, "Oh, these British, these English speakers," they call them. They say, "How the euro is going to break up? This is unthinkable." As if that makes it okay, right? It's unthinkable. All that you need is more political will. You've just got to throw more stuff at it to keep it together. The fact that it's an economic nonsense is nothing there. And I think, eventually reality comes through. Oh, yes, and it's come through in China, and it's come through in India.
It took a time.
It takes a time. It can take half a century, but it comes through in the end.
Well, Popper said psychology follows logic. What's first logical eventually the mind catches up. And Hume said this as well.
Yes,
Eventually
that's a good point.
the human race will catch up with the truth.
Yes, it's a good point.
Or die in the attempt.
David?
Or both.
Well, Russell said people would sooner die than think. In fact, they do.
This is probably a slightly obscure question, but do you have any idea why it is that Friedman was against a commodity standard to the extent that he was? I don't know whether he, given the fact that one had operated successfully for the best part of 50 years in the late 19th century.
I wasn't aware that he was all that against a commodity standard. I wouldn't have described him as that. I mean, he does in the essays on positive economics, he does talk about a commodity standard, and he goes into some detail about what it might look like. What he was, I think subsequently, I think he probably rethought that, because I certainly remember him talking about gold, which I put it to you as a commodity, and saying that, well, it's unusable as a currency, therefore you're going to have bits of paper, and therefore you've got a problem.
It just seems a strange perspective to take, given the fact that it had been used for the best part of 50 years, right through Europe and elsewhere as well.
Well, I think that his view was that the economies had grown and marched on since then. There was a fixed supply of gold that it depended very much on, mining and technology and all sorts of things like that. So it wasn't, what he was trying to get at, I think, is, this is sort of basis of monetarism. The basis of monetarism is, how can we design a monetary system where basically we have prices doing that,
Predictability,
rather than that, and certainly not that. So gold is no good at that, actually.
But he did it for 50. I find it so hard to understand why somebody like Friedman, a very clever man who read a lot of history and knew a lot of stuff and knew his statistics and his historical evidence, would say, well, what we want to achieve is broadly stable prices. So let's get the government to control the money supply, because then they can achieve that. And of course, gold can't do it. Whereas the historical records, that's exactly what gold had achieved and exactly what no government had ever achieved.
No, that's not quite true. His view was that there had been, and his historical view. I mean, he and Anna Schwartz, who's still alive, absolutely brilliant. Matters much hair, but brilliant. She and he, did. Yeah, he got a book, huge, two enormous books, Monetary History of Monetary Trends, going back to 1861. And they'd done all this stuff on this. He knew this backwards. I mean, he just knew all this stuff. And his view was that even under the gold standard, there were frequent crises that from time to time it buggered up big time. And the 1907 bank crash occurred under a gold standard. So gold, he thought, was not the answer to everything. And that a better, partly because of all these different pressures on it, they've got demand pressures and supply pressures and so on. And his view was that it would actually be, I think his view was that it would actually be better if you had, it doesn't matter whether it's a fiat currency, as long as it grows at a predictable rate. If it grows at a predictable rate, then prices will continue at a predictable rate, and then people can make rational investment decisions on the basis of them. Whereas gold, something might happen tomorrow. Gold is not worth any money anymore, and that's it. Had it.
Didn't happen in Germany.
Thank you very much.
All right, cheers. Enjoy the dinner. Oh, everybody of any class has just left.
No.
Yes. Okay. The main question has just left, so we ought to finish the meeting. Thank you very much for doing that.
All right, no, thank you.